And welcome back to our concluding lecture for this unit on social Darwinism and Darwinian evolution, these racial and hierarchical sciences, air quote again, sciences. And now will be our discussion of eugenics. And I will simply piggyback the end of this lecture and talk about the very, very final point, which is the global impact, or at least hinting towards what we'll talk about next week. So, what is eugenics? Well, you watched the video on eugenics, and eugenics essentially is a science in which experts and professionals, those who are experts and have knowledge of the world around them in terms of racial structures and hierarchies, superiority and inferiority in particular, try to shape and form society through policy. And this could come off as benevolent, at least on the surface, but often has a malevolent or darker tinge the deeper you look. Perhaps the most famous eugenicist in the United States, and also very, very popular, her writings were in Western Europe, was a woman by the name of Margaret Sanger. And again, she was talked about in the video, but there are others as well, men and women. A notable one, other than her, was a woman by the name of Charlotte Perkins Gilman. And if you have ever read a short story called The Yellow Wallpaper, that was written by Charlotte Perkins Gilman. And these two particular women were considered feminists, but I am not necessarily aligning eugenics to feminism, but they were feminists, and you'll see how this kind of gets incorporated later on. Essentially, what Margaret Sanger, and one of our readings this week is a excerpt out of her pamphlet on family planning and family limitation. Essentially, what Margaret Sanger and a number of eugenicists wanted to do was breed out inferior. Let me back up. There were a couple of goals in mind, especially with somebody like Margaret Sanger, who also had a feminist goal of empowering women, so to speak. But her views, because Margaret Sanger, if you don't know who she is the considered kind of the matriarch of the birth control movement. Now, the pill, quote, the pill did not exist during this time, but she was advocating publicly for the use of birth control, whether it was condoms or the diaphragm or other forms of birth control, especially birth control that was, birth control that was controlled by women themselves. Now, birth control goes back since the time of the Egyptians, and I assume probably before that too. The Egyptians were known to make condoms out of the intestines of animals that they had killed, and hence the birth of the condom. So there's been birth control since the world began. But in Victorian era and early Edwardian era United States and Great Britain, namely we're talking the late 1800s and into the mid 1900s, this topic was taboo. And while a lot of people were using birth control, it was not something that one would talk about very openly, and certainly not a woman. And so this is where the feminist tinge comes in, because not only was she talking about birth control, but she was talking about it openly. She was publishing it openly in society, and she was addressing women and making it a woman's issue in the sense that they had control over their, to use the term that we hear a lot now, reproductive rights. So that's certainly a political topic today, whether you are in favor of such you are in favor of such policies or have such beliefs or not. I'm not taking a position on this in this lecture, but you would call her the mother of the reproductive rights movement. However, she was a eugenicist. She had views that were definitely rooted in a number of these things that we talked about. Now, she was not a phrenologist. She was not a polygenicist. She did not have views like that, but her views definitely had a social Darwinist tinge. She was a woman who did believe in structures of society in the sense, in what we saw with social Darwinism and laissez-faireism. She definitely viewed the world in terms of a racial an superior and inferior hierarchical system like the pyramid that we saw. One thing that made her different, though, from a lot of the people that we've talked about, though, is her gender. She was a woman. And so she would not have viewed this hierarchy in the same manner that somebody like an Andrew Carnegie or a Louis Agassiz would have viewed it. She would have viewed it with a gender neutral sort of viewpoint. She saw men and women of this same class, this same higher social class, as being on equal footing with each other, and that they should be on equal footing with respects to the law. So, in that sense, she was a radical because she was throwing down the gauntlet of feminism and attacking patriarchy. On the other hand, though, she was a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant woman, and she was a woman who saw herself and her race as being definitely having superior attributes to others. And like Andrew Carnegie, she would agree that as a woman of this particular stature, it was her duty to educate and try to uplift these lesser and poorer and inferior people to try and better them in society. And that is definitely a view that a social Darwinist would have had. And of course, though Margaret Sanger isn't necessarily affiliated with economic systems, as I hopefully was able to make clear before, you can see how laissez-faireism and hyper-individualism kind of filters into this as well. So this is a slide that I took directly from one of the other lectures that I gave in my 339 class. So you have Margaret Sanger, Charlotte Perkins Gilman, who's not pictured. These types of people, these were reformers. These were reformists. And you could almost call them benevolent people in many ways because they were trying to address social ills. But when you take a step back and you look at what they were trying to do and you look at their rhetoric, it doesn't come off as malevolent as, say, a Tom Buchanan in The Great Gatsby. But it comes off as looking like they're like people trying to do the right thing. But then you look at it more and more and you see how it fits into our discussion, how eugenics fits into social Darwinism. So specifically, people like Sanger saw immigration, specifically immigrants, as being a major problem. These were people who were not able to fully integrate into society. They were coming over in very, very large numbers. They brought crime with them. In some cases, they brought disease. They brought the inability that they had from their native cultures, the places where they were born. They seemingly did not have the same levels of cleanliness that Western Europeans or Americans in this case had, British as well. They did not have the same concepts of hygiene, of an emphasis on education. And Margaret Sanger in particular saw this as a problem because you had these large inner cities that really didn't quite exist prior to the 20th century. They certainly existed in New York, as we saw in that clip from Gangs of New York. They certainly were in the North in places like Cleveland and Rochester, Detroit, Chicago. But now all of these cities, more cities, and then those cities were getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and they were becoming overcrowded. They were no longer settled by people from Connecticut and New York. Now there were Irish, and even more Irish than there were before, and there were blacks, and then there were Slavs and Poles and Czechs and Russians. And on the West Coast, in places like San Francisco, you had the Chinese, or they called everybody who looked Asian Chinese, but Asians in general, with all of the problems that they bring. They can't speak the language. They don't have the right hygiene. They bring drugs. They bring crime. And also the fact that they're all living in poverty. And Margaret Sanger was actually very attuned to the fact these people were living in poverty and was sympathetic to that. Although her solution to that was not always benevolent. She did work to try and uplift the poor. However, one of the solutions that she offered was that these types of people who were overcrowding the cities, who were filling up hospitals and homeless shelters, people who were also mentally infirmed or feeble-minded, as they would call it, they needed to be put in check somehow. And one of the best ways to put them in check was to curtail and control their population numbers. This could be accomplished in a number of ways. For some people, like Sanger and others, you could do it through immigration reforms, curtailing the number of people who were different from you coming into the country, but also it could be achieved through scientific advancement, mainly through the use of birth control. Birth control voluntarily by women, all women, including white Anglo-Saxon Protestant women, but also women who voluntarily chose it for themselves. Maybe an Irish woman who doesn't want to have 20 kids, maybe instead she just wants to have 5. She offered pamphlets in classes about birth control for women who were willing to accept it. Now, that doesn't seem terribly bad per se, but it does get worse. It gets more controlling, because in addition, she also was an advocate, and others like her, men as well, were advocates for certain legal and government policies that would enable the word just slipped my mind. I'm terribly sorry. Do I have it written down? No. Sterilization. So somebody who could do so birth control in the form of things like condoms and diaphragms. Again, like I said, the pill wasn't around just yet, although there were drugs, quote, drugs that could be used to prevent pregnancy and also induce abortions. That was something that she advocated for. But you also have her and others as proponents of sterilization. Sterilization could be voluntarily done, where a man chooses to endure some form of chemical or physical castration to prevent him from getting a woman pregnant, or from a woman receiving some form of chemical or surgical sterilization as well. So this would prevent pregnancy. And in some cases, you would have the involuntary sterilization of people. And this would be people perhaps that committed crimes. So they were in prisons. They didn't quite have the rights of those that would not have been in prison at the time. So they would have been able to perhaps, say, reduce some of their sentence if they chose to undergo a form of sterilization. And those that were committed to insane asylums or lunatic hospitals, state hospitals, could undergo sterilization to, in theory, prevent them from conceiving children that might have the same mental infirmaries as they have. And a mental infirmary at this time could be anything from a legitimate infirmary, mental psychosis, like a maybe schizophrenia, which they really wouldn't have known much about, or it could be somebody, and this is absolutely awful to say, somebody who might simply just not fit well into society. So you might have a woman who's a free spirit. If her husband wanted to, she could be committed to an asylum and she could receive treatment that is not something she volunteers for. Now, in that case, it's generally not going to be sterilization, but you see where I'm going with this. It is the power of certain groups of people who consider themselves superior, lording that power and shaping the way society looks and operates through this belief of superiority and inferiority. People like Margaret Sanger and Charlotte Perkins Gilman, to a lesser extent, or well, I should even say to a lesser extent, somebody like Andrew Carnegie, although he doesn't really focus on these issues, you can see where that kind of comes from. Somebody like a Tom Buchanan also would probably share a lot of these beliefs. And as we move later on, you're going to read a piece on the protection of the defense of German heredity and German honor and blood. And you're going to find a lot of talk of sterilization and population control. some of which was inspired by the writings of Margaret Sanger. So she is a controversial figure to this day. There are a lot of people that certainly celebrate her and others that rightly perhaps condemn her. I do want to point out, though, at least to note in these modern day political dialogues, and they are typically political dialogues, that yes, she did inspire some of Nazi law and literature. She was a woman who did support these measures, but she was not, say, an anti-Semite, and she was not an advocate of extermination of the races of the world. So you have to look at Margaret Sanger with a sense of nuance. But these particular aspects of her life, these views of curtailing the population and trying to improve the human race through curtailing population, through improving society, trying to decrease poverty levels, trying to weed out certain mental or physical ailments, handicaps, psychosomatic or physical, is a form of eugenics. And there are a number of these laws and policies that she and others had put on the table that are still in existence to this day. Now, remember the world that Margaret Sanger was looking at the time, and this goes for Great Britain as well. You had the factory system that was just polluting the environment around it with soot and dust, coal ash. You had, as remember what Henry George talked about, progress and poverty kind of linking arms together, where you had all of this progress. You also had extreme forms of poverty. So you had these inner city neighborhoods. They were overcrowded. They were filled with people who were coming from all of these places that were not particularly desirable to begin with in the eyes of some people in this country or in Britain for that matter. But again, Britain didn't really face an immigration issue the same way the United States did. And they were looking at people who were lesser than them in coming in large populations. They couldn't speak the language. They seemingly had hygienic issues. They were having large families. The populations were getting bigger and bigger and bigger, which led to more poverty, more crime, drunkenness, and drunkenness is always tied with things like spousal abuse, the lack of education. And so there was this desire to try and rein this problem in through population control. Here is a picture of an immigrant family sharing a one-room apartment. As you can see, this is the room. This is the one room that they lived in. And it was a stereotype, and it was partially true that you had these large immigrant families, some even larger than these, in these one-room tenements, sharing everything, living in poverty, living in destitution. And somebody like Margaret Sanger would think to themselves, think of the children. So why should these women be compelled to have child after child after child and could barely feed them with these minimal factory wages? Instead, promote birth control, promote population control. And in other cases, with people who are mentally unable to do so, institute reforms and policies that will curtail those populations and make society stronger. Should note that, and you could probably guess from how I worded that first part, that Margaret Sanger is also considered a feminist reformer. And so some of this was simply trying to curtail women having children against their will. And she was she was a pro-labor reformer too. So she would have been on opposite sides of the conversation with Andrew Carnegie, because a woman like Margaret Sanger would have been in favor of say, a workers' union, because the wages that workers were paid were not able to support a small family, let alone a large family. So you're seeing some resistance here. But nevertheless, eugenics, regardless of whether they were supporting that traditional hierarchy that somebody like a Tom Buchanan or an Andrew Carnegie or a Louis Agassiz would support, or something a little bit more radical like what Margaret Sanger or Charlotte Perkins Gilman would have wanted, still has these kind of racial and superior and inferior types of roots to them that may seem benevolent in one view, but are actually quite malevolent in others. You also had this issue. This is not entirely isolated to race and ethnicity, but you have these issues with mental handicaps and psychological issues, what they would have referred to as feeble-mindedness. So you have people who might be disabled. They might have uh, Down syndrome, schizophrenia. They might have bipolar disorder, but they might also have other issues that are not considered traditional mental handicaps, such as postpartum depression, which ironically Charlotte Perkins Gilman was writing about in the Yellow Wallpaper, where women begin to have these depressive states due to having just given birth. It was not fully understood at the time. But you also have these same people arguing for things like maybe women or men who are simply different in the way they behave. Maybe they're very creative. Maybe they are standoffish or very independent. Maybe they're homosexual and they would not have fitted in. So they need to be dealt with. They would have been people who would have had a mental disability. They would have not been people who would have fit in. Maybe not feeble-minded. You could have had somebody who's completely brilliant, but was also standoffish and didn't fit in, but they could possibly be controlled through various manners. That could be sterilization, as I mentioned before. On the right side over here, we have what is called a frontal lobotomy. A frontal lobotomy used to be very popular, performed in all the Western European countries. And in this country, really up until, I would say the early 60s, I don't think there's been a frontal lobotomy performed in this country since the 70s. I think it's not done anymore. Frontal lobotomy, as you can see here, is a surgery. It is a psychological, psychosomatic surgery done by a neurosurgeon in which an instrument is placed through the eye or above the eye. It doesn't actually go in the eye. It goes up through the eye into the brain. And holes are drilled into the frontal lobe. This was meant to ease the mental sufferings of people who had things like bipolar disorder and schizophrenia and other personality disorders. Now, on one hand, in some ways it did, because certain issues that we would later find out neurologically, issues in the mind stem from this frontal lobe region, and could be dealt with through surgical means. However, it also made the patient essentially a dependent for the rest of their lives. It made them unaware in many ways of where they are, of even who they are, unable to really function in life. They would require a caretaker. In some cases, they would not be able to even perform simple hygienic duties such as cleaning themselves or using the restroom. Essentially, a frontal lobotomy can make somebody disabled. And even in some cases where it's performed not to the same extreme, the person who undergoes it never feels quite the same again, and they are never quite the same again. If you've ever met anybody or know anybody who's had a stroke or who's had brain damage to the frontal lobe, then you know what I'm talking about. They don't quite behave the same way. In some cases, it's more severe than the other. So this has been outlawed now as being considered a form of cruel and unusual science. It's also extremely permanent. It cannot be reversed. And it simply was not. And also, a lot of people had it done to them who did not need it done to them. The most famous case would have been John F. Kennedy's sister Rose, who was considered to have certain mental issues when she was younger. It's not uncertain exactly what she had. She may have had a learning disability. She may have also been just a very outgoing and maybe standoffish young woman, and her family had a lobotomy performed on her, and she was never quite the same again after that. So this is all part of this movement. Lobotomies, sterilization, in some cases electroshock therapy, birth control, whether forced or voluntary, were all part of the eugenics movement to kind of curtail different things, whatever it was in the eye of the reformer, air quotes, reformer. In some cases, it was undesirable races, undesirable ethnicities, or mental handicaps, or what they would call mental infirmaries. People who were just not desirable and did not fit into the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant world. And even somebody like Margaret Sanger, who definitely marched to a different drum compared to the typical white male captain of industry. She would have been an outspoken woman. She was in favor of labor rights and labor reform. And some of her policies, like I said before, were geared to help women in particular, and even men who just simply did not make enough money to support having these large families. Why have large families when you could have use a diaphragm, use a condom, use a certain type of drug, other birth control methods, or maybe even seek an abortion in order to keep those numbers small? Because why bring a child into a world who you can barely take care of, who you can't take care of when you can barely take care of your own children? And because you come from a place like Ireland, you can barely take care of yourself. You can see the superiority complex that she has here. These people, as you'll read in her excerpt that I give you, these people can barely take care of themselves. They barely know how to take care of themselves. So how can they take care of more children when they can barely take care of the ones that they have and barely take care of themselves? But you can also see how this is very malevolent as well. It has a superiority complex here, and it definitely is trying to breed out undesirable aspects and undesirable people in society to better the race and make it more superior. And their vision of more superior is typically white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. And that's what we're looking at here. So moving ahead, how does this all work? I know I've alluded to it. In some cases, I've even said it. And I know that all of you are actually quite astute. I've really enjoyed reading your discussion. So clearly, you are not lost in this class as of yet. So where am I going with all of this? Well, next week, as we get into colonialism and as we get into imperialism, we're going to see these various types of ideas in play: nativism, social Darwinism, hints of phrenology, hints of polygenesis, or ideas that certain groups of humans are superior to others based on their ethnicity or where they came from in Europe. You're going to see eugenic type ideas, whether it's cultural or social. Social in the sense like population control, things of that nature. Cultural might be promoting English over a native language, promoting Christianity, Protestant Christianity over a native religion, promoting Western European culture over another culture in an area that you might have inhabited. So why do we have this issue? Because remember, we're in the age of industrialism. They need raw materials and they need markets. And so places like Great Britain, France, Germany, the United States, they're going to go into, quote, the lesser corners of the world and deal with these people. And they're going to institute laws and reforms to harness those raw materials, but they often have to work with the local population. And they're going to put in American and British and French laws and overseers. And they're going to try to masquerade this form of imperialism and colonialism in very altruistic ways, that they are bringing civilization, industrial civilization to the world, and all the benefits of industrial civilization, this hierarchy, as it will. They will now stretch, like Andrew Carnegie did, being the agents of the lessers, the agents of the poor. The British and the French and the Germans, the Americans, and these others will be the agents of these lesser people. They will guide them towards a greater place in this world by giving them Protestant Christianity, by giving them, or in the case of the French, it would be Catholic Christianity, but giving them industrialism, giving them new markets, taking from them their raw resources, but also selling back to them in return things like spoons and knives and European style clothing and European style foods, and giving them European education, maybe not the greatest education, but a elementary European education. So take a moment and pause this video and just look at these two uh, definitions here: colonialism and imperialism. We do use them interchangeably, and there is a good reason for that, but there are some differences. Colonialism really is the establishment of a system, whereas imperialism can be done through lesser and more indirect means. But next week, we will talk more about this. We're going to talk about the British going into India and China, and the Americans showing up in Japan, and also the Europeans in Africa as they divide up the country to, as one person said, save the Africans from themselves. It is very much all rooted in these ideas of social Darwinism, ethnic racial superiority, and as we've seen, offshoots of this: eugenics, laissez-faire economics, survival of the fittest, so on and so forth. So I hope you enjoyed this lecture as much as one can enjoy this lecture. I hope that you got a lot out of it. As I told you before, I was taking several different things from several different lectures in another class and threading them together. But I would hope that you can see the connections between the previous week and the connections between the previous week, this week, and the next week. And you can also see the connection of these things among themselves and how they kind of feed into a system of a belief of cultural and ethnic and social superiority in all aspects of Western European society. I want to point out that I'm not picking on Western Europeans, as we will talk about with the Japanese and to a certain extent with the Chinese. Lots of cultures, lots of people of different races certainly believe that they are better than other people. The Japanese do this throughout the 1920s and 30s. The Chinese had done this for a time among themselves and among their neighbors, and strong and powerful African kingdoms had done this to a certain extent as well, believing that they were a cut above their neighbors, and in fact some of their neighbors that they conquered and sold into slavery to Europeans. But in this period, 1900 to 1945, it is going to be the Western European show, and to a certain degree the Japanese too, as they adopt this Western European view of social Darwinism, social, cultural and ethnic and racial superiority. Even if they don't adopt laissez-faire economics, you can see the kind of the myth, how laissez-faireism kind of fits into this, and in a very dark and twisted way, far darker and twisted than we see here, eugenics, and where they can take eugenics. It is absolutely astounding, and we are all familiar with the Holocaust. Indeed, the Holocaust will be discussed, as well as other things as well. So I hope that you enjoyed this lecture, again, as much as you can. Good luck for the rest of the week. Enjoy the readings. Enjoy the other videos. There'll be a quiz that will be up probably Thursday or Friday. Good luck with all of that, and I look forward to reading your discussion posts. Have a good evening.